I just want to make sure we don't have technical interference. Yeah. Maybe like this a little bit, so it's not too loud. Yeah. Okay, good morning. Thank you again for coming. This is the third part of our discussion of Leonardo. It's going slow, but then he was slow as a painter as well. Took him forever to complete anything. That's the sort of the hallmark of his work. And actually he said once, how can anyone ever finish anything? He is also, in addition to that statement that every painter paints himself, another famous word associated with Leonardo is non finito. Nothing will ever be done. Everything is process. And because everything is process, everything changes constantly. And how can you capture change? And I think that as you look at these drawings, you can see that when Leonardo draws, he is trying to capture the movement of things and phenomena. Just like he was doing that with light on a human face, he's fascinated by how water moves. He's fascinated by how flowers move, how things grow, how they transform. Even in that enclosed garden of the Virgin, he was painting all those little pieces, bits and pieces of the turf, of the grass, moving under the movement of the wind. So this is what interests him. What is it that makes this world move? But before I get carried away with this lecture, I just want to mention that on Friday there is a film about Leonardo as a scientist and inventor being shown here at 1 p.m., 45-minute long film that I was also not aware of. It's part of the film program, a free screening. So after the lecture, if you don't have anything happening at 1 p.m., you can go and watch that movie. So that's just a small announcement I wanted to make. Because I certainly am not qualified to speak about Leonardo the scientist. I know too little for that. I'm only an art historian. So what you see here are examples of two of his drawings. And of course, on the right side, you see drawing of a flower. On the left side, you see something that looks like huge wind in mid-air, but it's supposedly an image of a storm with lots of water in the sky, or image of a catastrophe, of disaster. Leonardo is said to have gone many, many times above Florence, in the hills above Florence. He would climb up, especially on days when they expected storms. And he would sit under a kind of shelter, a tree or a cave or something along those lines, and he would wait for the storm. So from that vantage point, to observe the world below and to see how huge and powerful nature was. Because as you heard yesterday, he thought that God was light. And he also thought, like many of his contemporaries, that God is everywhere. Now, again, we can ask ourselves questions, was he a conventional Christian? And I have asked my professors when I was a student of Renaissance art, and when I would look at all these people, I would say, how could this person be a regular Christian if he was doing X, Y, and Z? Not just about Leonardo, but many other artists. And we say we have no way of knowing, because even if they had so-called heretical ideas, they never wrote them down. Then they would be burnt at the stake. So whatever they thought remains there in their heads. All we have to judge in terms of their belief system is the work they created. And sometimes maybe some cryptic messages to friends. But what is very clear about Leonardo is that he saw God as a force that exists in every natural thing. And in a sense, something like a pantheistic faith. Like you look at a flower, there is God. You look at water, there is God in it. And therefore, because God is everywhere, and that's kind of like something that anticipates Spinoza, who will eventually say God is nature and there is no other God. But at this point, we are way too early for Spinoza. The point is that because God is everywhere, everything deserves to be painted and known. By knowing a flower, you know God. By knowing what people make, you also know God, because we are also creation of God, or manifestation of God. So it's kind of like a divine intellect, some kind of mechanism that controls the whole world. That's how God exists for Leonardo. So, and I juxtapose these two drawings because they are about seeing God in the smallest of things and seeing God in the largest of things. In a storm, in the sky, and also in the smallest of flowers. And of course, when you look at this drawing, which is also in the Windsor Castle, the Star of Bethlehem, it is known as, you realize that what he's doing is, with certain degree of precision, he's trying to capture the appearance of all of those little flower petals. But at the same time, what he's doing is he's capturing the phases of growth of the flower. He's like a botanist. He's not just basing his drawing on direct observation of a single flower specimen, but he's also looking around and trying to see, how does this thing come into being? So he gives you over here different angles, different perspectives, views of different degrees of development of the flower. Furthermore, if you look at the drawing, you realize that above and beyond that central cluster of flowers and petals, there are those little leaves to the side and barely sketched flowers on the upper left, which tells you once again that this man, this is a mind constantly at work. And as he sketches, he develops and leaves behind traces of the evolution of that thought. You know, he didn't just give us a nice, precise, clean, neat drawing. But what you're seeing is a pensiero. You're seeing that mind at work. So, one more thing before we move on. What you notice is that there is an incredible sense of vitality and movement in here. One of the marvelous things about this particular flower is that it does look like a storm. All these leaves are just moving around. So that business of the vital force in things is what excites him. And this is something that we will see again and again in all of these drawings that he will create. That's another wonderful close-up view of that same drawing. And I look at this and I'm thinking of the storm over the river, over the Arno Valley. And I'm seeing that, you know, Albrecht Dürer in Germany did fantastic botanical studies. I don't have one in this particular presentation to show you. Dürer, other German artists, and once again, Northern European art influenced Leonardo, because Leonardo was very, very curious and didn't want to stick to the conventions of Florence. In Florence, hardly anyone among his contemporaries bothered with this kind of work. As a matter of fact, Florentines took pride in being able to tell wonderful stories. And Michelangelo said, when they asked him once, what do you think about us, the Italian artists, the Florentines, versus the Northerners, those people above the Alps? And he said, we are the only ones who know how to tell the stories from the Bible or antiquity. But those people above the Alps know how to draw the most minuscule details of the world that we don't care about. But Leonardo did care. And Leonardo looked at those images, and they came because of these collectors like Bembo, and he developed this fascination with capturing the most minuscule, the most detailed of things in nature. So yes, German artists of the Renaissance had this tradition of very delicate drawings, but in their case, most of the drawings would be very decorative, very fully finished, almost like decorations for illuminated manuscripts. Whereas in Leonardo's case, it's not so much about creating an object of beauty that you sell. These are not drawings intended to be sold to collectors. These are drawings that are intended to be preserved as objects that demonstrate knowledge and understanding, and kept in the studio in these sketchbooks, kept in the studio to educate others about the appearances of things. That's another marvelous one. And of course, once again, you realize that his interest is in the movement of all of these petals and flowers and leaves. And here is another beautiful flower study, Metal Point. This is from the Accademia in Venice. And of course, what's really precious about these images, unlike paintings, a painting, from the moment it is conceived in the head of the artist to the moment it's finished, the painting has to move from what we call the private to the public sphere, because that painting goes and gets to be displayed in a church or in a private collector's house. But when you talk about these drawings that Leonardo kept, these are the most private and intimate kinds of studies. Leonardo probably, had he had the time and means, would have loved to have transposed these drawings into prints, etchings that other people can learn from. That did not happen with the flower studies. It did happen with his study of faces, of human faces. So let me just show you one more detail. And you see the chiaroscuro, the light and shadow. In this particular case, when we're talking about these drawings, every single line is there. These are not drawings that try to be fully three-dimensional, accurate, capturing the appearance of the petals under different conditions of light. They are much more scientific in their intention. And you can see that what interests him is how things bend and turn and twist, how they open and close. It's a fascinating study of his thought process. And here is one more exquisite drawing. When you consider, again, that these are not things made for money, not made for clients. This is work in progress, study of God in nature. And every single thing is a manifestation of what? The processes of coming into being, growth, maturation. Because the way he sees this business of germination and growth, that's what interests him. How do we come into being? How do things mature to create fruits? That's a wonderful one in particular. So yes, there are countless and countless of drawings. And on that note, I just want to bring up one more. And just to focus on one of the many, many notes he left behind. Marvelous, stupendous necessity, thou with supreme reason compels all effects to the direct result of their causes, and by a supreme and irrevocable law, every natural action obeys thee by the shortest possible process. Everything in nature is because of necessity. There is no choice here. Everything exists because it was ordained necessity. This is where God is. It's controlled by some kind of divine intellect. Who would believe that so small a space could contain the images of all of the universe? In other words, you look at a tiny little flower, and in that small space is the replication of the entire universe. Oh, mighty process, what talent can avail to penetrate a nature such as these about the petals? What tongue will it be that can unfold so great a wonder? There is nothing that is not wonderful, meaning full of wonder and marvel. Verily none, that it is that guides the human discourse to the considering of divine things. That's it. That's the secret. Through the little flower you get to divinity. Here the forms, here the colors, here all of the images of every part of the universe are contained, contracted to a point. What point is so marvelous? So I don't know which exact point and which exact drawing he's talking about. But what he's telling us is that truly, like a person working with a microscope, this is where God resides. You look at the point and it's all there. And it's about the law of necessity and the idea of getting to the most direct result by the shortest path. That everything in nature finds the best path to get there, to the fulfillment of its reason for being. So yeah, he's a great philosopher. I mean, this is why he said, I don't care about painting. That's why he spent 5-6 years working on a single work. Because he thought that painting was wonderful. He loved painting, but he also considered painting a distraction of sorts from his science. Because he wanted to know so much more, and there was no time. So this is that female head I started with last year, and the reason I got back, last lecture, yesterday, last year, yes. But the reason I wanted to come back to this angelic creature that is female head, and we have no idea what it is except that it's related to the adoration of the Magi, is because of, you know, that garland of flowers, the Bacchic quality, the somewhat pagan quality, but also I'm coming back to it because I wanted to mention once again that Leonardo also found in the human nature incredible sort of continuum from extreme beauty to extreme ugliness. When you read some of his notes, you will be fascinated by the things he says, such as how noble and lovely we are and how lowly we are. We are like bags of excrement, he says at one point, and nothing more. We are contemptible. I mean, Hamlet will say that, Shakespeare will say that, but this is well before Shakespeare. But Leonardo looks at us also and at himself with this incredible duality. On the one hand, marveling at the beauty of what humans can do and can be. On the other hand, with a certain despise at bodily functions, at how we are compelled by certain passions to destroy the other. So he really almost clinically studies the human behavior and human nature. And he loves, of course, this business of idealization or enhancing what is already there in nature to the point of creating a creature that looks like from the Platonic world of ideal forms. And that's one more thing I want to mention. Leonardo is accurate, but there is no creature like this anywhere. Leonardo studies human beings and likes to capture individual expressions. But at the end of the day, he is, if you will, some kind of a meeting point between an Aristotelian approach to representation, and according to Aristotle, everything is based on perception, accurate representation, and recording of the visible, empirical approach, and the Platonic approach, Plato, with his notion that everything in the visible world is a pale reflection of an ideal world, and that the duty of the artist is to paint the ideal rather than the real. In the Renaissance, there are these two poles, Aristotelian way of thinking and Platonic way of thinking. I mean, this goes back to antiquity, but when they rediscover Plato and Aristotle, they say Plato said that everything in the visible world is just a mirror of the ideal world. The duty of the artist is not to be stuck in the material reality, but to paint the beauty of that ideal plane. Aristotelians would say, hold on one second, everything is here. Empirical, real, precision, testing things, experimental approach. So I think that in Leonardo's case, you have a wonderful combination of the Platonic and Aristotelian. This is very, very idealized. Now, that's not real either, the grotesque head in profile. But since I mentioned that he looks at human beings as this range of being, just like at plants and trees and everything else, He says, how can something that starts out as being so beautiful become so grotesque? He's fascinated, like in Ginevra da Vinci, how the interior beauty, the virtue that you carry within is reflected in your external appearance. And in much the same way, he wants to see how the evil nature of somebody or evil emotions, destructive emotions, turn that face into grotesque. And he will create a whole series of grotesque heads. He's actually, among other things, inventor of what we call caricature in Western art. And his grotesque heads would be then engraved by one of his students, Melzi, and they were very popular throughout Europe because they were available in multiples, and other artists in the 17th century learned from Leonardo's grotesques. Why does he like to paint grotesques? Again, to show you that a single form under different motions of the mind and emotions can be transformed completely. Just like in the Last Supper, the apostles show different emotions. So beauty and ugliness are all together within the same human being, and they find manifestation. We know that Leonardo spent countless of hours studying all kinds of mechanisms, devising machines. And of course, today's scientists oftentimes go back to some of Leonardo's prototypes, and they try to see if they can concoct something on the basis of Leonardo's plans. We know about the fact that many of these machines, of course, never worked, but while he was living both in Milan and later on in his last years in France with the King of France, who adored him, gave him all the time in the world to entertain himself with his various fantasies and fancies, Leonardo did mechanisms for court entertainments. At one point, there is an account in Vasari that he created a mechanical lion who walked on stage in front of the King of France. So he created different mechanisms that worked and caused marvel in the audience. But that for him was perfectly serious enterprise because it was about learning modalities for movement. And of course, what's interesting to me when I look at this drawing is that everything goes at the same time. There's a beautiful face there. There's a tiny little drawing of a human being. There are machines. So it's all one and the same thing for him. It's not about perfect subject matter. It's not about discipline, quite the contrary. But then he also can be far more studious and focused on a specific topic. And of course, the most important thing that he really focused on and contributed a lot to was our understanding of human anatomy. We all know that at this point, anatomy or dissecting human bodies was something that had to be done under very controlled circumstances with very special permissions. Only few people in society could have access to a corpse for very specific purposes, like, let's say, students of medicine. Anatomy did exist, dissection did exist, even within that Christian world. But the way Leonardo did it was surreptitious. He didn't want to be part of those anatomical theaters with the medicine professionals. He would essentially, literally get corpses through one way or another, fetch them, buy them, acquire them, human beings that were not claimed. There were plenty of people dying around who were not claimed. And he says in his notes that he had dissected at least 20 corpses, and he was doing this in the studio in the back room, and he would work all night in secrecy and write notes because he was not within an official setting to dissect, so that was frowned upon. But as he dissected, as he learned, he made copious notes. And truly, I will show you, vis-a-vis everybody else who had done anatomical drawings up until this point, these are fantastically advanced ones. Some of the best the best anatomical drawings up until this point in the world are done by Leonardo. Only in the late 16th century, Andreas Vesalius, an anatomy doctor from Brussels, is going to have more systematic drawings available of human anatomy, and those will be published in an anatomy book that will be the primer, the most important anatomy book for a whole century, the Vesalius Anatomia. But what is Leonardo doing? You can see he takes notes, and then little body parts appear here and there. And then what's really fascinating is the degree to which, just like in the studies of flowers, he is showing you different angles, and he's showing you different movements or suggestions of movement with all of these muscles. And like a doctor, he jots down what happens as the body turns, what happens as the energy, the internal energy causes those muscles to flex and become more tense. He numbers the parts. He puts marks there, letters, and then he explains to himself what goes on. So part of it is for the purpose of better painting and better drawing. Part of it is an independent inquiry into the movement of the human machine. And that's another key term. He saw us as a machine. And here is what he tells us. Describe each muscle, what finger it serves, what limb, represent it therefore simply without any impediment from any other muscle that is placed over them. And in this way you will afterwards be able to recognize the parts which are injured. Can you imagine? This is for purposes of healing. He wants to tell people, how do you heal? You will never know the shape of the shoulder without this rule. Right? How each muscle can become extended or contracted or made thinner or thicker, and which is more or less powerful. In other words, this is not a painter, this is almost like a doctor. He tells you this is how you learn which muscle is injured. If you know that in the Renaissance, around 1500, medical doctors are quacks. I mean, they're still performing these crazy operations like extracting the stone of madness from people's heads. Medicine is very, very primitive. So this is extremely rational and extremely enlightened approach. So his secret operations of dissection had multiple purposes. This is not a painter who is learning how to paint pictures better, how to paint human beings. He wants to learn how we move. And this is a wonderful example of those drawings of movement. And this is yet another one. You can see them side by side. And of course, what he's trying to do is to combine, again, this kind of view into the interior with the view of the exterior. I mean, this is utterly unrealistic. Think about it. He's showing you the tendons and the muscles of a so-called living person. In other words, this is something very, very odd. They are anatomical studies, but these people that he shows seem to be alive. So what he's doing is, again, he uses the knowledge he has acquired from individual dissections and the knowledge he has acquired from looking at real human beings in motion, posing in the studio, and he's trying to fuse that together into a single image that shows you a living and a dead, or the external and the internal facet of man. Very, very strange. In other words, again, the Platonic abstraction with the Aristotelian precision. And this is, again, one more passage that I want to focus on. If any muscle whatsoever be drawn out lengthwise, a slight force will break its fleshy tissue. If the nerves of sensation be drawn, nerves of sensation, just think about the sophistication here, be drawn out lengthwise, slight power tears from the muscles where their, ramification weaves them together and spreads and consumes itself. And one sees the same process enacted with the sinewy covering of the veins and arteries which are mingled with the muscles. What is therefore the cause of so great a force of arms and legs which is seen in the actions of any animal We are animals, by the way, like everyone else. We are just animals. One cannot say other than that it is the skin which clothes them, and that when the nerves of sensation thicken the muscles, these muscles contract and draw after them the tendons in which their extremities become converted. The extremities of muscles become tendons. This man is learning so much about the body. And in this process of thickening, they fill out the skin and make it drawn and hard. And it cannot be lengthened out unless the muscles become thinner. And not becoming thinner, they are a cause of resistance and of making strong the before-mentioned skin. So it's studying living being in front of him and how the skin changes, how the muscles change in front of his eyes as he touches a living creature, and then studying the dead creature and dissecting and removing the skin and portions of the muscles in order to see what is inside. Can you believe that he actually went so far? He speaks about veins and arteries and nerves. Can you believe that he went so far as to even show us the lungs? To an extent possible, what goes on inside? It's unbelievable. The more you look at him, the more marvelous he becomes. And what's interesting is when you see this in contrast to 15th century anatomical drawings that existed before Leonardo. I mean, right? We don't know who made this, the illustration, but the inspiration probably came from Galen or Galenus, who wrote about medicine in antiquity. And by the way, this is printed in 1491, 10 years before Leonardo makes his anatomical drawing. So this is the comparison to what exists before Leonardo. This is another one of those. It's night and day, to say the least. Here is the night and day. That's one of those 15th century, late 15th century anatomical treatises versus how Leonardo draws the female torso. The one on the left, I mean, it's completely schematic. It's so old-fashioned. It's so abstract in a sense. Leonardo shows you both the abstract aspects, meaning these are the organs, this is how they relate, but he also shows them as something that he has seen with his eyes and recorded with his eyes. And here is just one more of the examples of how skeletons were drawn before Leonardo and how skeletons are drawn by Leonardo. So this gives you a very good sense of how amazingly different this man is. Then, this whole idea that everything relates to everything else, like what we said about God, God is in the flower, God is in the storm. He compares there a scalp skin with onion. And he tells you, just like in nature you see the onion with all these layers, the same thing applies to our own composition. And he actually writes about it. This is also in the Royal Library in Windsor Castle. Or when he shows you these studies of embryos, extremely famous, from, we don't know exactly the years, but we know that towards the end of his life he had more time for these anatomical studies. But when you look at these embryos, it's just like the Star of Bethlehem, the flower I showed you at the beginning, where you have everything from germination to fruition. Can you imagine, what was he dissecting in order to understand that the embryo evolves? How many pregnant women, at what stages of pregnancy did he have access to, bodies unclaimed, so that he could see how that embryo evolves over the gestation period? Or he used the study of flower to anticipate what goes on in a female body. We don't know, but this is incredible what he's showing us here. And how things grow and change their forms, as opposed to this, of course, right? just as a comparison. And this, I'm sorry to be showing you some unpleasant quotes, but you have to understand Leonardo. Look at this. The act of procreation and the members employed therein are so repulsive that if it were not for the beauty of the faces and the adornments of the actors and the pent-up impulse, nature would lose the human species. So you have to really dress up and have all those frills and laces and whatnot. And there is the desire, which is the necessity that compels us forward. Otherwise, we would die out instantly because we are so repulsive fundamentally. So this is how he sees the contrast of the beauty and ugly in the human beings. And this is just another of those drawings that talks about this idea that for Leonardo, the most important thing is not just how things appear, but to reinforce the point, how things act. How things act, because through the action of things you learn about the machine. And the machine is God. The machine is where God is, what keeps us moving. So the human being moves, the horse moves, the rider on the horse shows an expression, a passion. So it's the energy of things that make us happen and stay around. That leads me to one of the most famous of his drawings, of course, which we will talk about briefly, the search for harmony in the Vitruvian Man. This is the famous drawing of the human being that appears in a circle, and by the way, that was drawn by many, many other people prior to Leonardo. In other words, the idea of the Vitruvian Man comes from antiquity. I'll go back to the passage in a moment. This is the Leonardo Vitruvian Man from 1492, which is the most famous of these Vitruvian models. But what is this whole business of Vitruvian Man? Just to explain to you where this comes from and what this drawing actually means. It has to do with a Roman architect and architectural theorist, Vitruvius, the single most important architectural theorist in antiquity. And it was Vitruvius, in his treatise on architecture in ancient Rome, in the Architectura, Book 3, he talks about the so-called ideal proportion of the human being. And this is prior to Christianity, of course, right? Ancient Rome. So he says, similarly, in the members of a temple, because Vitruvius talks about what makes a beautiful building, he's an architect, and he codifies the whole notion of beauty in architecture. In the members of a temple, there ought to be the greatest harmony in the symmetrical relations of the different parts of the general magnitude of the whole. Then again, in the human body, the central point is naturally the navel. If a man can be placed flat on his back with his hands and feet extended and a pair of compasses centered at his navel, the fingers and toes of his two hands and feet will touch the circumference of a circle described therefrom. Just as the human body yields a circular outline, so too a square figure may be found from it. If we measure the distance from the soles to the top and then apply the measure to the arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, etc., as in the case of a plane surfaces which are completely square. So Vitruvius wrote this in his treatise on architecture, and everybody was trying to see how can we draw the Vitruvian Man, and nobody succeeded. And there were all these artists who tried to envision what Vitruvius wrote about. But before I even get there, just want to tell you, why was man important to Vitruvius? Because in the Greco-Roman world, even though they're not Christians, they also see the human body as sort of the most ideal form on earth. We are the highest of all creatures, and therefore we contain within us an ideal that we have to excavate by means of geometry, math. So they were trying to see how can the human body be put in a square and a circle at the same time, because those are two ideal forms Square is always earth, circle is always heaven. So how can you put that ideal form, which is the human body, both in a square and a circle? And of course, in the Renaissance, as they rediscovered ancient architectural theory and classical Roman sculptures, as well as architectural edifices, they also were seeking to understand this notion of beauty and symmetry in architecture, and they used the human being as the principal model or module for architecture. Brunelleschi did that first, already in 1430s. So other artists before Leonardo tried to put the human being that Vitruvius talked about at the same time in a square and a circle, and it was all awfully awkward until Leonardo came up with a brilliant little device that actually, in order to put that human being both in a square and a circle, you really cannot do and extend the limbs to both figures at the same time, but you can only if you move the body. So the body contains within itself, it can be fitted in within proportions of the square and the circle. The trick is movement. The trick is adjustment of the body. Everybody else tried the absurd. How do you fit this in a square and a circle at the same time? So he said, and this is from the Accademia in Venice, the drawing, and this is where he says, if you open the legs so as to reduce the stature by 1/14 and open and raise arms so that your middle fingers touch the line through the top of the head, know that the center of the extremities of the outspread limbs will be umbilicus, and the space between the legs will make the equilateral triangle. He figured out it has to move. And that's when you get the Vitruvian Man. This is why this is such a famous drawing. Otherwise, you couldn't have the man touching both the edges of the circle and the square. And people have wondered who is the man in the middle of this. And some people have argued, including Isaacson in the biography, that this very, very handsome man is actually one of Leonardo's students' companions, a certain artist by the name of Salai, but we don't really know. But it is an ideal male figure as Leonardo envisioned it. So movement is key. And on that note, I just want to conclude today's talk by looking at a couple of drawings from nature. And when he goes to the universe, the large universe, I mentioned, he went over the Arno Valley, and this is what he says in one of his notes, how he went among the gloomy rocks, came to the entrance of a great cavern. Two contrary emotions arose in me, fear and desire. Fear of the threatening dark cavern, desire to see whether there were any marvelous things in it. What a great statement that is. It anticipates almost the romantic sentiments where poets say, oh, I'm standing on the edge of the cliff and I want to jump, and I also want to run away because I'm so afraid. And Leonardo has this fantastic sense of adventure and knows that risk, fear is natural, but that you also have this fantastic curiosity. And these are just some of the drawings. And I just want to show you, in order to give you a better sense of how incredibly abstract Leonardo could be. Because once again, this is not just specificity of drawing the very minuscule, but it's also the ability of the mind to go from the small to the very large, even the things that he could not have seen ever. Look at this. Bird's eye view of seacoast. He's like a map maker. He is known to have walked for miles around Florence in Tuscany, trying to figure out how the mountain ranges are arranged. But can you imagine this solo guy? He's not even trained as a cartographer. He's making some of the best maps available until this point. The accuracy is incredible. How could he do that? By abstraction. Observation with abstraction. Plans for a canal to bypass the Arno. canals,